The End of Oz, Chapter 13, Dorothy. Sure, some of the caves were sort of cool, if you were into that kind of thing. Glowing crystals and weird underground springs that ran into underground rivers, and tunnels that led you in circles. Caverns that were obviously storerooms that haven't been touched in decades. Dust-covered wooden barrels full of who knows what. Ancient weapons, spike-balled maces so heavy I couldn't lift them, huge crowbars that seemed designed for giants, cannons rusted into immobility. The Gnome King droned on about the history of his various ancestors, and although I tuned out his sonorous voice, I was acutely conscious of the weight of his arm in mine. He hadn't changed either. He was still dressed in his velvet suit. The material was soft and cool against my skin. "How fascinating," I murmured, every time he paused. At least he seemed to have relaxed. It was as though he'd never had anyone to listen to him before. Some men were like that. Let them get going and they never stop. It never occurred to them to ask if anybody else wanted to talk about herself, as if I had nothing interesting to say. Then again, maybe he was just lonely. As he talked, I serendipitously looked around me, trying to memorize the layout of the palace. But it was an absolute maze. Every corridor branched off into 1,000 others. Every room looked like a room I'd passed already, and everywhere I realized the hallways were empty. The Gnome King had his forces, his munchkins and his diggers, and the other gnomes I'd briefly seen at the banquet. But the palace dwellers were engulfed by his enormous palace, rattling around like peas in a glass jar. No wonder he needed my magic. As powerful as he was, his forces were nowhere near enough to take Oz. It all came down to him. And that I understood, because at the end of the day, while I'd had armies at my disposal, Oz was all about me. It was exhilarating having that kind of power, but it was also isolating, a huge responsibility. The more time I spent with him, the more I realized how much alike we were, but the Gnome King could have learned a thing or two from me. I kept Tin, Scare, and Aline around for a reason, not just because they were useful. They were also company. "But you must be bored of all this," he said suddenly, as if he read my mind. "Tell me about the history of Dorothy Gale." "You mean how I came to Oz?" I asked, blinking up at him. "No," he said. "Your history before. I prefer not to talk about that. I never talked about the other place. I had had people's fingers cut off for the mere mention." "But darling, how are we ever going to know each other if we don't share?" he asked. I hesitated. I needed him to trust me. Was this the price of admission? "Dorothy?" I took a deep breath and told him about Kansas. At first I told him everything I'd hated about growing up there. The miserable winters that lasted for months, the miserable summers the rest of the time, working like a serf on Aunt Em and Uncle Henry's farm, my so-called friends who turned on me after my first visit to Oz. And then I started thinking of the good things, about the parts I hadn't even realized I'd missed. The first big snowfall of the year when the prairie turned into a sea of white that stretched all the way to the horizon. The happy cluck-cluck of the chickens every morning when I brought them their feed, the warmth of the leg-laying shed in winter, Aunt Em's apple pies, the way the prairie grass smelled in summer before the heat settled into us to make us all miserable. I never told anyone as much as I told the Gnome King. Not Ozma, back when I thought we were friends, not even Scare and Tin and the Lion the first time I traveled with them in Oz. Back then, I'd spent the whole trip to the Emerald City chanting "home" like a mantra. I stopped talking. Something unfamiliar was happening. A lump in my throat. It hurt terribly. Was I dying? "Dorothy, you're crying," the Gnome King said quietly. He brushed a tear from the corner of my eye with a long, silvery finger. "Certainly not," I said quickly, clearing my throat around the unfamiliar sensation. I don't know why I went on so. I don't miss the other place for a minute. It was barren and boring. "Coming to Oz must have been very strange for you," the Gnome King said, drawing me forward again. I hadn't realized we'd stopped walking. "It was wonderful," I said decidedly. "I'm sure it was," he agreed. But to be separated from your family so young, orphaned like that, forced to make decisions as a ruler of a nation. I'd loved my family. That's why I'd brought them with me to Oz, but they were gone. I was here, and that was all that mattered. I'm perfectly capable of handling pressure, if that's what you mean, I said coolly. This was going all wrong. I was supposed to be pretending to be vulnerable, not actually vulnerable. What on earth was wrong with me? I don't doubt that, he said with a smile. He had led me to another hallway. This one much wider than the rest. The ceiling towered above us. This hall ended in a huge set of iron-bound wooden chairs. Welcome to Major Hall, my ballroom, he said, flinging the doors open. I couldn't help it. I gasped. Ballrooms were the cure for almost anything. The Gnome King's ballroom was more than beautiful. It was magnificent. The ceiling was so far overhead it was lost in darkness. Massive ruby chandeliers, dark now, floated overhead, glittering readily in the scant light from the hallway. The floor was made of polished red stone. I took a few steps into the enormous room. The click of my heels echoed eerily into the darkness. I was reminded of a Halloween-haunted house Aunt Hem had taken me so long ago in the other place. There had been a room that felt like this. Vast, empty, but not entirely empty. Haunted. I was suddenly very aware of the fact that the Gnome King and I were deep within the bowels of his palace, and we were entirely alone. A shiver ran through me. Not fear. Something else entirely. I turned to him. It's perfect, I said, and I meant it. I had no intention of dying here, of course, but he didn't need to know that. I thought you might like it, he said. And I realized he meant it, too. For once, we weren't playing a game. We were standing in this enormous room surrounded by darkness, two of the most powerful people in the world. Alone, together, I stepped forward and let my hand slide down his arm. My fingers twined with his. He didn't resist, and so I kissed him. His cool lips parted in surprise, and then he leaned into me and returned the kiss. His arms wrapped around me, his fingers tangled in my hair. And I knew in that moment, whatever else was to come, whatever we might do to each other in the end, this moment was real. Neither one of us was pretending to be anything other than what we were. But I couldn't lose control, because no matter what, I had to remember that this man intended to kill me. There was nothing about him I could trust. Reluctantly, I broke away from him. I lowered my eyelashes, giving me time to recover my racing thoughts. I couldn't let him see he'd caught me off guard. You're full of surprises, Dorothy Gale, he murmured. There was a shift in his tone. I could see in his eyes that he, too, had forgotten the game for a moment, so it was my turn to take advantage. I'd like our wedding to be very grand, I said in the same hushed tone he just used. Hundreds of guests. Of course, he says, his eyes a little glazed, but then his glaze sharpened. Hundreds? I was thinking of a more intimate affair. I'll bet you were, I thought. Perhaps even his subjects drew the line at human sacrifice. If he was still planning on killing me, he wouldn't want an audience. But I needed Amy in the palace when I made my move. If I knew she was coming, I could defend myself against her. But with my luck, the Gnome King wouldn't. She was my backup plan. If Amy didn't kill him, she could distract him long enough to give me a chance to escape. It was a risky plan, but I didn't have a lot of options. I insist, I said, my tone flirtatious. I want a celebration that shows off your riches, my treasured love. I want our subjects to be able to appreciate your magnanimity in your largesse. My love, your kingdom is ever to be much older and finer than Oz. Surely you have nobility. Princes and princesses, dukes and duchesses, all sorts of important persons whom you wish to witness our union. Why? He asked. I concealed my irritation with a considerable effort. Because that's how it's done, my darling, I said. In royal circles, anyway, the citizens of Ev don't even know their future queen is among them. You want a party? I was getting used to his hairless eyebrow arching and recognizing it as what he intended it to be. Not a party, I clarified. A wedding. with musicians and canopies and pretty dresses and a battalion of servants and a mandatory dress code and a feast, wine and spirits. Dress codes. Inspiration hit me. Amy would have an even better chance of getting into the palace if the guests wore disguises. In fact, I said, let's make our wedding a costume ball. Wouldn't that be fun? He looked at me for a long time. I couldn't tell if he was running through what I just said, trying to figure out what I was up to. The game was back on. I hid an exhilarated smile. That does sound fun, he said thoughtfully. I believe we once did that sort of thing here ages ago. I even went to those balls you speak of, though it's been a century or two, and I do think fashions might have changed. Balls never go out of fashion, I said at once, pressing my advantage. And how often will you be married, my darling? Only once, I hope, he said dryly, looking at me. I kept my smile even and serene. Would you like help in planning our ball? Just your guest list, I said brightly, and perhaps a few connections to the kitchen staff. He smiled, showing all his teeth. Certainly, darling. Let me know if you need any help. But our wedding will take place tomorrow regardless. Tomorrow? I said, trying to not show my shock. I simply cannot wait a moment longer to be united with you forever, he said. But that's nowhere near enough time to plan a ball, let alone a wedding, I protested. These things take weeks, months. I must insist on more time. There is nothing you cannot do, my love, he said with a smile that looked almost genuine. I have utter faith in your abilities. Tomorrow morning we shall be wed. Next week, I said. Give me a week, my treasure. He frowned, impatience stealing across his cadaverous features. Tomorrow afternoon, if you insist. This was ridiculous. I had less than 24 hours to plan the most important day of my life. I wanted to throw something at him. Darling, it's not possible, I purred. His frown deepened. Are you reluctant to join our two kingdoms, Dorothy? There was no mistaking the veiled threat in his voice. Any stalling for time I did now, he would use against me. I knew, of course, the real reason he wanted to rush our nuptials, but I couldn't show my hand. I had to play along. At least give me a day to prepare, my beloved, I murmured, fluttering my eyelashes. Can we agree on the stroke of midnight tomorrow night? After all, our guests will need time to travel to the palace. Impatience and doubt were replaced by amusement on his face. My subjects do not live so far from the palace, dear Dorothy. I do not allow them to stray. Not the important ones, anyway. I find it convenient to keep them close if I need them, or if I need to punish them. Involuntarily, he touched the knife at his side. I swallowed hard. But I am aware that Oz's customs are not Ev's. Let us wed at midnight, as you wish. Shall I show you to our rooms now? I nodded, my mind racing, and let him guide me back to my chamber. His hand rested on the small of my back as we walked, and I couldn't shake the pleasure of his touch. At the door he leaned down and moved to kiss my cheek, but I turned my mouth to his instead. This kiss was even more passionate than the first, and I knew there was no small amount of satisfaction that he was breathing hard when we finally ended it. Good night, Dorothy, he said quietly. This time he didn't bother to lock my door. Mistress, Bapu cried, leaping to her feet. I clapped my hands. All right, Bapu, no slacking about. We have work to do. Mistress is getting married tomorrow. But, no buts, I said. Trust me, I know what I'm doing. You are very clever, Bapu breathed, her eyes huge. Yes, I said, I know. My first mission, better clothes and better food, and a source of cocktails. Finally, Bapu turned out to be useful. The Gnome King seemed totally indifferent to the day-to-day mechanisms of his palace, but Bapu knew everything from the humblest kitchen slave to the best seamstress. There was no time to sleep. I sent Bapu to her with a message to begin my costume immediately. As it turned out, Bapu also knew where the spirits were kept. I should have asked her ages ago. The Gnome King sent a secretary to my chamber to draft up a list of important and wealthy personages that ought to be invited to the nuptial ball, and I set him to work hand-lettering invitations worded as thinly veiled commands. The absolute worst thing is throwing a party and having no one come. I figured threats would fill the room, even on such short notice. I had already figured out that the Gnome King's subjects took his commands very seriously. That was one more thing the Gnome King and I had in common. We valued loyalty and obedience, and we weren't afraid to enforce the things that were important to us. I decided to costume myself as a serpent. Powerful, dramatic, deadly. But the scales of the dress would also bear my signature gingham spirit. I wanted the citizens of Ebb to see their future queen looking her absolute finest. Who knew? Maybe they'd even rally behind me. I entertained myself briefly with a fantasy of overthrowing the Gnome King in a citizens' rebellion and ruling Ebb and Oz by myself, but soon dismissed those thoughts and turned back to my work. I had a lot to do, and very little time in which to do it. I had a seamstress to oversee, menus to revise, a bloodthirsty tyrant to either seduce or escape from, and the pungent but highly effective liquor in the Gnome King's stores wasn't going to drink itself.